Well, good morning, everyone. Wonderful to be opening God's Word with you as always. As we come to the end of this series in Daniel, we're up to chapter 12, and it's been amazing to see all of the different stories that we might be familiar with in Daniel come together in this overall pattern that shows God's sovereignty, his call for his people to persevere and be faithful because he's working his purposes out. And those things are on view at the end of this book. And that's the question that this chapter deals with. Is this the end? Is this the final moment of God's plan working out? That's what's highlighted in this chapter. And one of the questions that really drives this chapter forward is, can it get any worse? Because the end times are marked by suffering and trials and persecutions and difficulties. And so the question on view is, can it get any worse? Now, flippantly, that's a question we've all asked ourselves from time to time. I can remember distinctly that moment where I wondered, wow, can it get any worse? I remember I was repairing a sash cord. I think I've got a photo of it. The windows in the room where I'm standing today are sash windows. So there's two pieces of glass and you kind of lift one up, and in these ones in my house there are springs to kind of balance the weight so it doesn't fall down. In the old style ones in the house where we were living, there are sash cords. It's a rope like this. I think that's braided cotton rope, quite handy. And so the cord goes up over a pulley and the window's on this side, and the weight of the window is supported as it's balanced by the weight of the pulley. Works wonderfully, works for 20, 30, 40, 50 years, who knows how long, until the cotton cord finally rots away and snaps. And so that's what had happened in that particular picture that I showed a moment ago. And so with Liz away on holidays, I think, with the kids, it was a stinking hot evening. I thought, I'll finally get in, I'll fix that sash cord. And it was hard work. There I am. In 99.9% of those windows, there's a little timber panel and you can kind of take that out and get access. But I thought it should be there, but it wasn't there. And everyone I've spoken to has looked at those windows and thought, I've never seen windows like that. And I was labouring away there in the sweat, and it was hot and dirty work. And finally, I'd managed to fix all of the rope in position in the right way. And late at night, there I was ready to go to bed. And as I closed the window, guess what happened? The cord on the other side of the window snapped. They're in pairs, of course. I'd fixed one side. And as I was closing it, ready to go to bed, clunk, the other one broke. That's the sort of moment where we ask ourselves, can it get any worse? Can it get any worse? It's one of those moments that's tempting to burst out in rage, or to laugh hysterically, or to just cry. And it might not have been fixing a sash cord. It might have been that big project you were working on, and at the final moment it falls apart. It might have been the birthday party that you're organising for your kids, and you had that fantastic cake and it was all coming together, but just at the end it all just falls apart. It might be that job that you'd been working on and working towards, and you thought it was finished, and it's late in the working week and you're ready for a relaxing night, and you realise it's all fallen apart. That's the question. That's the kind of heartache that drives this passage forward. Is this the end? Is it going to get any worse than this? When will it finally finish? And so we dive in as we see that question on view in verse 1 of Daniel chapter 12. At that time, Michael, the great prince who protects your people, will arise. There'll be a time of distress, such has not happened from the beginning of nations until then. But at that time, your people, everyone whose name is found written in the book, will be delivered. I've heard of this book before. These last 3 chapters of Daniel is one vision from this angel to Daniel, and it's appalling and it's overwhelming and it's pushing him down. He can hardly stand, and it's all about this book of truth. You know, God's plan worked out. It can't be changed if it's written in the book, and this is what's going to happen. And we realize here that this is the worst possible time, a time of a great prince, a time of great distress, but also a time of great deliverance. This is the greatest time. You remember Muhammad Ali, of course, who was famous for calling himself the greatest. I am the greatest, he says, and I've done handcuffed lightning and put thunder in jail and tussle with a crocodile and wrestle a whale, those sort of things. He called himself the greatest, the ultimate. That's the idea that's on view here. This time that the angel is talking about, this is the ultimate time of distress. From the beginning of when there were people in nations, this is the worst time, the greatest time of distress, but also the greatest time of deliverance. And here we have perhaps the clearest description of resurrection that we see in the Old Testament. We'll pick it up in verse 2. Multitudes who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake, some to everlasting life, others to shame and everlasting contempt. The idea of resurrection is in lots of places in the Old Testament, and we're so used to, as Christians, reading about Jesus' resurrection, and it becomes fairly familiar to us, and we can sometimes miss the allusions to it, the kind of shadows of it in the Old Testament. But here is a very clear depiction of resurrection. Those who sleep in the dust, and notice it doesn't say those who are dead and gone, but those who are asleep, and that's often in a sense, a euphemism, maybe a metaphor is a better word, the way the Bible describes death. It's not final, it's a sleep. And I really wish this verse said something different, because the idea of resurrection that it has on view for us is something that we find unpalatable. We don't like it. The idea that some would rise to condemnation, and some would in fact face hell. And that's a difficult thing for us to hear. The women over the last couple of days have been logging on, the women of Golgong and Mudgee churches, but also some others as well. That's one of the blessings of this time of lockdown and this time of videos and things, that people around the state were able to connect to listen to the Equip Women's Conference about eternity. And their resurrection was certainly on view, and lots of great questions about resurrection bodies and what that will look like, but also a great encouragement of the confidence that we can have for those of us whose names are written in the book. Remember, this is a vision of the angel given to Daniel to show what's written in this book of truth. And it's set, and it can't be changed. And the delightful thing is that those whose names are in the book will be delivered, will be raised to everlasting life. That is a wonderful truth. It's the constant testimony of the scriptures. In Revelation 20, we see a glimpse into heaven, and their books are opened. There God will judge. And we're used to the idea that good people will go to heaven and bad people, well, let's not think about what happens to them. We think this idea of facing God is about being a good person or a bad person. It's not. Let me repeat that, because it's an idea that we pick up from the Simpsons cartoons, from every popular novel that's read, TV shows. If you're a good person, you go to heaven. It's just not true. The way it's expressed here is, if your name is written in the book, you're raised to everlasting life. And if it's not, condemnation. We are used to the idea of our name being recorded, especially in the last few months. We had the census, of course, a couple of months ago, but that was a bit of a non-event. Maybe you did it online and I haven't heard anything from it since. But every time you go into a cafe or a pub or a shop or a supermarket or a fuel station, when you come to church, when we start church again in a couple of weeks' time, but even before we went into lockdown, you scan the QR code and your name is recorded. And so we're used to this idea of our name being recorded. And the contact tracing will continue, it seems. The cases, it seems, will continue. More and more likely, you will get a call. I heard this week they are announcing that the app will alert you, just in the app itself. If you've been at a place where there's someone with the coronavirus has potentially exposed people. Now, it's interesting to think, which list do you want to be on? Your name will be recorded. You don't want to be on that list of people who were there at the same time as the person who was infectious. You'll want your name to be able to scroll through and go, it's okay. I was there at a different time. I wasn't at that place. That's not where I was. My name's on this list. I'm safe. That's just a fairly flippant way to point and highlight to the fact that we want our name in what the book of Revelation calls the Lamb's Book of Life, this book of truth. You want your name in that book, and the only way to guarantee it's not by being good enough or not being too bad, but by trusting in Jesus. He's shed his blood for us. He's washed away our sins through faith in his sacrifice in our place. It's the great truths of the gospel which only apply if you embrace them by faith, that your name might be written in that book. And I know that women over the last couple of days have been reflecting on that and thinking, are they part of the resurrection to life? And so that's my challenge for you. Don't rest easy until you're confident that, yes, I'm part of that book. My name's there because I've got faith in Jesus. And I'm going to love him and serve him with my whole life, whatever that looks like. Don't rest until you have that sort of confidence. In this greatest distress, we get a great deliverance, this resurrection. And so we move on to the obvious question. As the angel has said, there is going to be this time of great distress. It's going to be unequaled and it's going to be problematic. And it's when? When will that happen? That's the question on Daniel's lips, of course, in verse 5. Then I, Daniel, looked, and there before me stood two others, one on this bank of the river and one on the opposite bank. One of them said to the man clothed in linen who was above the waters of the river, "How long will it be before these astonishing things are fulfilled?" The man clothed in linen who was above the waters of the river lifted his right hand and his left hand towards heaven, and I heard him swear by him who lives forever, saying, "It will be for a time, times, and half a time, when the power of the holy people has been finally broken. All these things will be completed." Wow, lots happening there. There's this image of one on one bank of the river. Remember, this is all part of the last three chapters of Daniel, this image, this vision from Michael. And there's one on this side of the river, one on that side of the river, and one in the middle of the river kind of floating above the waters. I can't help but think of the presence of God in creation, floating, hovering over the waters, the formless and empty waters. And this one in the middle lifts his hands up to heaven. It's a very solemn and profound gesture. What he's about to say is trustworthy and true, and you should listen to that. This is solemn. This is somber. This is trustworthy. How long will it be? He says it will be for times, time, and half a time. And our ears prick up because we've heard that again in the book of Revelation in chapter 12. And that's where we're told that one of the images of these tumultuous times will happen for times, time, and half a time. And Lots of people have tried to figure out exactly when that is. And the different experts I was reading this week have said, well, it could be this, it could be that. Later on, we get those two numbers, 1,290 and 1,335 days. Why are they different? How does it work? And it seems like this is a symbolic time. The best way to understand it is a symbolic time of evil that is constrained by God, a temporary time. It's not a full time. The number 7 is associated with God's completeness, so 7 days of creation, God's completeness, and time and again in the Bible, in different points, it echoes that idea that God's timing is 7. Think of how often should you forgive your brother or sister? 7 times? No, 70 times 7, that's complete. God's time is 7, and so this is half that. So times 2, and time is 2 plus 1 is 3, and half a time is 3.5. So it's exactly half of God's sense of complete time. God's in control. He sets his time. It might seem like within the 3.5 that evil is running rampant, but it's just doing what God's allowing it to do in that time. And so the question is when? When? And there's this symbolic answer, but there's a little bit more detail in the passage that makes us wonder when exactly that will be. There's a little more detail about what will happen there. We can't be precise, but we need to ask, is it our time? Because lots of the things we read about in the scriptures seem to be happening right now. And not just the things that we read about in Daniel 12, but the broader testimony of the scriptures talks about plagues and earthquakes and difficulties and controversy and wars and rumours of wars. So read Mark 13 and Matthew 24, which borrows on lots of this imagery. We've had an earthquake this week. We had a tornado just down the road at Bathurst. We're living with coronavirus. And I want to say that, yes, it's now. We are living in the end times. We are living in the final day. That day, I think, between Jesus' death and resurrection and ascension and his return, the last days. This is the time in which we live. In a sense, anyone reading Daniel 12 could have concluded the same. This is the time in which we live. And so, as difficult as it is, our response should be one of confidence and peace. That's what we thought last week. Knowing what we know, we aren't overwrought with distress, even though things can chop and change. And so this week there was what seemed like a sudden announcement that we're out of lockdown. Even though that seemed like a backflip on what we'd heard before, we just kind of made a plan that we're sticking with. October 31st is when we're back to face-to-face church. But suddenly we're out of lockdown. And then just as suddenly the Premier resigns. And our times seem difficult. That shouldn't surprise us. It surprised me. I was a bit shocked and I'm rebuked by it. We should expect things to be unsettled. And so with that knowledge, have peace and confidence, knowing that God told us this would happen. God told us our times would be like this. And so with confidence, pray for our neighbours who might not have the same hope as us. Pray that God would limit the evil in the world. Pray that God would bring about his kingdom. We can be confident and joyful and prayerful and content, knowing that even in difficult times like ours, God's working his purposes out. He told us this would happen. And so that peace and contentment, like I said last week, is a great example to our neighbours. But is there a specific time? Yes, it's true that this is kind of always the case in the last days, but is there a specific time that Daniel has in mind? I think we can look at different kind of specific times where this has seemed to be elevated. And people living in those times would always have said, yeah, this is the time that Daniel 12 is about. And they're half right. It's not only that time. It's not only the time of the Uyghurs in northern China who are in concentration camps, or the people of Afghanistan who are facing all sorts of uncertainty and confusion. This is not just restricted to their time, though. This is the same truth as the time of Nazi Germany, when people would surely have thought, wow, Daniel 12 is about our time. The same time as Stalinist Russia and the cleansing that happened there and the murders of millions of people. My history lessons aren't good enough to pick all of those times through 2 centuries, 2.5 centuries, soaked in blood. People have wondered if this was the time of AD 70, when the temple is destroyed. Is it the time of Antiochus Epiphanes in around the 2nd century BC? And some have said it matches so well with what was happening there that Daniel must have been written about it. There, the suffering of God's people was intense. Is it that time? Let me read a little for us later in the chapter. There's a focus time that I think we should bear in mind that we might not otherwise notice. Verse 11. From the time that the daily sacrifice is abolished and the abomination that causes desolation is set up, there will be 1,290 days. Blessed is the one who waits for and reaches the end of the 1,335 days. This seems to be a particular time on view. There's a particular intense time of persecution. These things are generally true, but when is the daily sacrifice abolished? It seems like that's happening in the time of Antiochus Epiphanes in around the middle 2nd century BC, where he comes through and sacrifices pigs on the altar and forces the Jewish people to eat pork and murders people, and it's incredibly intense. When's the daily sacrifice abolished? I want to say that the focus that seems most apt, not just from here, but from Mark 13 and Matthew 24, is the time of the cross. You see, up until Jesus' death, there was the daily sacrifice for the atonement of sin. But Jesus' sacrifice is once for all. And that's where the written code is nailed to the wall, if you like. That's where the abomination, not just of pigs on the altar, not just the blood of pigs spilt and splashed around, but Jesus, the Son of God, on the cross. The blood of Jesus shed for his people. That's the darkest moment. Literally, at noon, the sun stopped shining. Darkness covered the land. The earth shook. There, Jesus says, it is finished. So, friends, we live in a glorious age. Daniel was told to seal up this scroll and to seal it. It's been done, and he doesn't understand it. He's confused about it. He is sent to his rest, not really understanding this. Looking back at the events of Jesus, we can understand it. That is the delight of our age. And so, friends, when we ask, can it get any worse? No, the question to remember is, we are looking forward to when it gets better. Not just better, but when everything will be complete. I want to turn to the very final verse here. And I'll leave you to look up perhaps a couple of verses that talk about the taunting of death in 1 Corinthians 15. Where, O death, is your victory? Where is your sting? You've been defeated. Or in Colossians chapter 2, I think it is, where the powers and authorities have been disarmed, they've been defeated, they've been triumphed over. The victory of Jesus is nailed to the cross. But I want to finish with this last verse in our chapter today, because I think that presents a wonderful response for us, having looked at all of Daniel over these last weeks and this chapter now. As for you, go your way till the end. You will rest, and then at the end of days you will rise to receive your allotted inheritance. It's a wonderful truth. Daniel, even though he didn't understand it all, even though he didn't have what we have in looking back at the history of the cross, is called to go to his rest. You have a sense of peace and contentment until you rise to receive your allotted inheritance. And friends, that would be a delightful response for us. In the confidence of Jesus, those of us who have faith in Jesus, knowing our name is written in this book that cannot be erased, knowing that we too will rise to receive our inheritance. Friends, go in peace. Amen.